All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. As Felicia said, my name is Christine, and I'm going to be your crystal host for today. We're here in the Cousin DIY studio. We're in sunny Clearwater, Florida. It's sunny and 75 right now, so I do apologize that I'm in a tank top, and I'm sure some of you have some snow falling down right now. But anyway, thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to get started. Again, we have Maggie in the background who's going to be helping us answer any questions you have. Please don't hesitate to ask them as we're going along, so that we can get those answers ready for you. All right, so if we want to go ahead and get started, we're going to take a look at the materials first, and we'll go over those with you. So first off, you're going to need your wooden egg. This is the large style that you can get from Michael's. So we're going to need one of those. You're going to need some white matte acrylic craft paint, Mod Podge. I used a little bit of this white iridescent glitter. You don't have to use the glitter. It's just my preference. You're going to use the Bead Landing Crystal Radiance glue pen. And you're definitely going to want to get yourself one of these wax tip setters. This is great for picking up flatbacks. Or if you want, you can get this style here that comes with the Crystal Radiance set. And it's a great little storage option for if you don't use any of your crystals afterwards. You can store them in here. And then this comes with 2 little wax crayons. You're going to need 1 package of the SS12 Golden Honey, 1 package of the SS10 Light Rose, 1 package of the SS12 16 and 20. It's called an Amethyst Ombre. And then 1 package of SS12 16 and 20 of a violet. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and excuse me, I forgot the most important part, your bunny napkins. So again, I found these in the Easter seasonal section at Michael's. I thought it was perfect for exactly what we needed. So you're really only going to need 1 napkin to do this with, and the rest you can save for your Easter dinner. And then you're going to use this, I think it's a 1/4 inch gingham ribbon is the one I picked. But again, you can select any kind of ribbon you want. This was just my preference. All right. So what we're going to do is first step is we're going to paint our egg. I chose to paint mine white just because it kind of stood out a little bit against the napkin we're going to use on it. All right, so I'm just going to squirt a little bit in my little paint container here. And you're going to get your foam brush. And these are just the little cheapy ones you can buy at Michael's. They're great for any kind of painting project. All right, and you just want to paint that white paint on. And don't worry about the coverage so much. Some people like that kind of whitewashed look. I do especially, but if you don't like that look, you can go back over it and do a second coat, and that'll give you a little bit more coverage. Yeah.
Oh, can I remind everyone to use the hashtags too?
Please do.
Please make sure that if you do our project with us, that you use the hashtags Make It With Michaels and hashtag Create With Cousin, so that we can all see your product too.
Yes, please do that. I love to see everybody's projects when they're done. So a little history of the Fabergé egg, because I'm a super big history nerd. So the House of Fabergé was actually founded by Gustave Fabergé in 1842. And then his son, Peter Carl Fabergé, was the one who actually made the Fabergé egg famous. Oops, I used Mod Podge instead of paint. Here. Sorry. Anyway,
Would that
so
work as if you didn't have paint, could it be an alternative?
well, it could if you wanted to keep the wood grain look, but there is no color in Mod Podge, so
Oh, I see.
yeah, so it's gonna dry kind of crystal clear. But again, if you want to use that, if you want that wood grain look, that natural wood grain, I don't see why it wouldn't work. So I'm gonna do another coat just to get a little bit more coverage on here. And again, you don't have to do this, but I'm choosing to do so. So the series of 50 Fabergé eggs were actually created for the Russian imperial family, the Romanovs. They were created between 1885 and 1916. There were 50 in all that were created. And only about, I believe, 47 or 46 are still survive today. I believe there are about 7 still missing that no one can find. Yes, so it's a big mystery. Okay, so after we have our egg painted here, we're gonna set this aside and we're gonna let this kind of dry a little bit. So I'm gonna just move that over here. And then you're going, while that dries, you're gonna take your bunny napkin and just kind of, you're gonna unfold it here. So once you do that, the napkin has 3 layers. So kind of take a corner and you're gonna only want that top layer of napkin that has the design on it. So you're gonna peel off the backing layer here. So just peel that off, throw that away. And then there's gonna be one more layer that you're gonna wanna peel off. If I can get it. There we go. So then that layer is gonna come off as well. And then you're left with just this front piece of the napkin that has your 4 bunnies on it.
That is so cool.
I didn't get that. Could you?
Excuse me, Siri. I was talking. So now you're gonna cut your little bunnies into 4s. So I'm just gonna use the natural line of the napkin and I'm going to cut those.
Do all beverage napkins do this?
Yeah, you can actually do this with most any napkins. It's kind of cool. Some of you guys might have already have tried this before, but it's really fun to do. And you just use your Mod Podge and you just put it on, you know, whatever surface you want. I've only done it on wood surfaces, but I'm sure you can do it on other surfaces. So now that I have these cut into 4s, I'm basically just going to trim around the edge of my bunny and the flowers. It's not going to be neat and pretty. Trust me on this. You just kind of want to get some of that excess off. So as you can see here, I'm just kind of trimming around, leaving just a little bit of an edge.
That bunny is so cute.
I love this. And it works out perfectly because the size and just the shape of it, it looks so cute when it's Mod Podge onto this little egg. Okay, and I'm almost done with my little first one here.
A lot of people from California today.
Oh, wow, awesome. California is such a beautiful state. I have heard that California is getting a lot more rain than what's used to, right? So now that I've kind of trimmed up my bunny, you can see it's nothing neat. It's not, you know, the edges aren't clean, but that's okay. That's once you put it on your egg, no one's going to know any difference. So do this with the remaining 3 bunnies you have. Is there anyone who has tried this napkin and Mod Podge technique before?
I recently Mod Podge something the other day in preparation for this class, and it was one of my favorite. Yes, some have done it a few times, and other people have tried it on vases or on glass jars. That's cool.
Ooh, now that would be cool. I have not tried it on a glass jar. That's a really great idea.
Yeah, I think so too.
Oh man. And you know, the thing that I love about this, like using the napkins, is there's so many possibilities. Like, I mean, there's napkins for every occasion. I just feel like there's so much you can do with it. So,
Lena's tried it on ceramic tiles too. That's cool.
oh, see, I'm gonna have to try that. All right, so now I'm just trimming up my third little bunny here. Again, it doesn't have to be clean or neat. You just want to get a lot of that excess of the white part off of your napkin.
Kimberly recommended another YouTuber too who also does Mod Podge.
Oh,
That's
nice.
awesome. We'll definitely check that out.
Yes, thank you. All right. Okay, 3 down, 1 more to go. Yeah, but again, like this is super easy. It's really fun to do with kids. You can do some really cute stuff. I just love this little bunny napkin that I found at Michael's. But again, you might already have something laying around that you like that, you know, goes with your home decor or your Easter decor. So really it's just kind of your preference of what you want, you know, your design to look like. And then once we get our design Mod Podged on, we go back and we kind of embellish it. You know, we add our crystal radiance crystals and we add our ribbon, and it just comes out really, really, really cute. All right. So now I have all 4 of my bunnies cut and trimmed. And I'm going to check this. Yep. This paint is great. It dries super quick. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my Mod Podge and I'm going to get a clean brush here. And I'm going to put a little bit of Mod Podge in my little basket here. And I'm just going to kind of paint a little bit on, not a lot. You don't want a lot, just enough so that your little bunny napkins stick. So I'm going to use one and I'm just going to gently kind of place it in the middle here and just kind of give it a little tap. Now it's going to crease in some spots. That's okay, especially at the bottom because the surface is curved and the napkin really isn't. You're going to get a little bit of a curve, but that's okay. So once you kind of have that tapped down, I just take a little bit of Mod Podge and then I start brushing it on top. Yeah, and so that kind of helps flatten it down. And you just want to do that all over your little bunny. And you can see those edges of your napkin, they kind of just disappear. So that's why I was saying, like, you don't worry about, you know, making a clean cut because you're not even going to notice it, honestly. All right.
Nancy and Jan said that they've tried doing this with Christmas ornaments and they turned out great like that.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. What a great idea.
And Angela says that she's used it on mason jars, and when you Mod Podge the napkin to the metal lid of the jar, it ends up with a neat metallic look.
Really?
I love that you can do this for all these holidays.
I know. See, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is such a great technique to learn, and it's super easy. Again, really fun for kids to do. Yeah, it's just great. It's great fun. A lot of possibilities. Okay. So as you can see, I kind of, but mine kind of creased here. I don't know if you all can see that a little bit, but that's okay. That's kind of what gives it that like antique-y look, which is kind of what I was going for. So now that I have my first little bunny on, I'm going to go to the complete opposite side. And again, this is by no means like, you know, official middle center, just kind of eyeball it. That's what I do best. And I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to get a little bit of my Mod Podge. And I'm going to just put a little bit down so that I can place my bunny on. Okay, so then I'm going to get my second little bunny here. And again, I'm just going to gently kind of plop him down, give it a little bit of a tap. Okay, and then I'm going to go back over it with my Mod Podge. Just be a little bit gentle when you're brushing it onto the napkin part because it's just a thin layer of paper pretty much. So sometimes it'll tear, which again, it's okay if it does, because usually, you know, you can fix it. But just be a little gentle when you're kind of brushing it on top of the napkin.
Lena wanted to know, what if you iron it on? Would it take out the wrinkles?
I don't know that ironing it on would take out the wrinkles. Because it's just going on a curved surface, that's just kind of the nature of the beast, I believe. So my guess would be that it wouldn't really help with any of those wrinkles.
Would ironing it burn it?
Yeah, I would be very cautious of using an iron just because it is a thin layer of a napkin. A napkin is paper, so it could kind of burn it or singe it. All right, so now that I have two sides of my bunnies on, the other sides are going to overlap. So that's kind of what we want. So when we put the third and fourth bunny down, you're going to see the flowers are going to overlap a little bit, but it's going to be nice because then it kind of makes a little bit of a little border at the bottom. So again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to kind of just put a little bit of our Mod Podge in the center here. And then we're going to take our third bunny and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to just place him down and then give him a little bit of a tap.
Monica has a great suggestion too. She says if you create 4 or 5 small cuts at the bottom of the napkin, you won't get any creases.
There you go.
Thanks, Monica.
So yeah, if you don't want the creases, you can do that. I kind of like the creases because it kind of gives it like an antique look. And that's kind of what my Easter decor contains. But again, if that's not how your decor is, then yeah, go for it. All right.
I love how the flowers overlap. It's like they're sitting in a garden bed.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I thought these napkins were just like the cutest for this project. All right, so now I'm going to be putting my fourth and final little bunny on. And again, we're just kind of going to go over the top of this. Need a little bit more Mod Podge here. All right. Now that we have all that kind of Mod Podge down, I like to add a little bit of sparkle. Now, again, you don't have to do this if you don't like the glitter. Skip this part. If you're anything like my husband, he absolutely hates glitter. But you know, that's why I like to use it. So, so this is my little glitter tray here. You can use a paper plate, you can use a paper towel, a piece of newspaper, just something that's going to catch your glitter. So now that my Mod Podge is still kind of tacky, I'm just kind of sprinkle some of this on and then give it a little twirl. Do this little guy.
Cameron says my dad hates glitter.
Yes, yes. My husband actually despises it. But you know, sorry, not sorry. You knew me when you married me. Never met a sparkle I didn't like. So. All right.
A couple people are trying the project with us.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, that's so fun. I always wonder about that, you know, like if you're just kind of watching and then wait to do it, or if you're actually like doing it with us. So that's awesome to know that you're doing it with us. Okay, so I want to put a little bit more glitter at the top here. So I'm just kind of gonna dab a little bit more Mod Podge up at the top. Give it a little bit of sprinkle. All right. So now that that's on, we're kind of going to just let this kind of dry just a little bit. We're not going to let it dry too long just because we are on a time limit here. But at home, if you want to let it dry for, you know, maybe 10-15 minutes, that's probably good enough. Mod Podge dries fairly quickly. But what we're going to do next is we're just going to put a light layer of Mod Podge over the glitter layer, just so that it kind of keeps it contained. Otherwise, the glitter would kind of brush off as you handle it. And that would give my husband very much of a panic attack. So we don't want to do that. So again, if you have time, let it sit for about 10-15 minutes if you can. If you are working along with us though, it's not a big deal. You're going to just put the Mod Podge on top of the glitter. So when you're doing this step, don't swipe it. Okay. You want to just dab it. You want that Mod Podge just to kind of get dabbed on, because when you swipe it, it's going to basically move your glitter around, and that's what we don't want. So just take a little bit of Mod Podge on your sponge brush and just kind of dab it in there. So that's all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it and I'm just going to dab it all around. And that's going to help seal our glitter onto our little egg here. Michael's does sell a Mod Podge that has glitter already in it. So yeah, again, if you wanted to add the glitter, but you didn't like the mess of the glitter, you could always do that to give you a little bit of extra sparkle in there. And if you don't want the glitter, that's fine too. So again, we're just kind of dabbing it on. We're not really brushing it. We're just dabbing it. Let me get my top layer here. All right. So now that that's on, we're going to put our Mod Podge and our brushes aside. And again, you want to let this dry about 10-15 minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to let that dry right this second, but it's okay. It's not going to hurt the project. It's just going to be a little bit more messier as we're making it. So not to worry. All right, our next step is we're going to take our ribbon here and we're going to make the the little edges here of our ribbon. We're going to do that on all 4 sides of our bunny. And then we're going to make a little bow at the top. So to do that, I use my glue gun here. And I just put a little dab of glue at the bottom. And then I'm going to take the tip of my ribbon and I'm just going to press that down. Okay. And then I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to bring it over the top and then back down the side. And then you're going to go in between your bunnies here. Okay. And then again, I'm going to put another little dab of glue and just stick that remaining ribbon down. And then you can trim off the excess here. Okay. And you're going to do that same process and you're going to wrap it around the other side. So again, just a little dab of glue. I'm going to take my ribbon, just kind of set it down in that glue there. And I'm going to wrap it up around the top here. And then back down. Put another little dab of glue. There we go. And then I'm just going to trim my excess off. Okay.
Laura once says we are using images printed on rice paper made specifically for decoupage instead of a napkin.
Oh, cool. Even better. All right. So now that I have my glitter on, I have my ribbon done, I'm going to put my little bow at the top. So you want to cut probably about 6 or 7 inches of your ribbon. And then you want to make two little bunny ears like so. And then you're going to just tie a knot with those 2 little bunny ears. So one's going to loop through the center there. And you're just going to pull it through, give it a good yank to make the knot. There we go. And then once you have it, you can kind of play around with it and kind of straighten it out if you want. All right, so I'm going to just trim off the end here because one of my ends came out a little bit longer. And then you're going to put just a little dab of glue right there on the top where the ribbons crisscross. And I'm going to put my little bow right in the center of that glue. There we go. All right. So I found this cute little glass cup at the thrift store. If you have like a little candlestick holder, like obviously something with a larger base, I just thought this was the cutest little base to put my little egg in. And you can use this for decoration. So again, just got this at the thrift store. There's tons of good finds if you take a look. So, but now I'm going to use this to help hold up my little egg while I do my stones. All right. So now that we have our ribbon on, now's the fun part. Now we get to add our crystals. So these are the crystals that I have chose to use for this project. There's a ton of colors to choose from though. If you didn't go with this bunny style napkin and you kind of went with your own design, just kind of pick out crystals that match your design of your napkins, kind of the color scheme. These are the ones that I felt matched with this color scheme. So again, we're doing the golden honey, the light rose, the amethyst ombre, and the violet pack. All right, so I'm just going to line up my crystals. I have some that I've already opened up here to make it a little bit faster. And I will say, it does help if you have your wax tip jewel setter. This makes it so much easier and so much faster. I highly recommend this tool when you're doing any kind of flatback project. And you're going to need your Crystal Radiance glue pen. This is seriously some of the best glue for flatbacks. It dries super clear. It's got this precise tip on it, so you don't get a lot of glue that kind of spits out everywhere. And if you do happen to put too much glue on, it dries absolutely clear. So it is perfect for this type of project. So what I did first is I just started using my violet and my amethyst ombre here on the ribbon. So you're going to take your glue pen and we're just going to work in small sections. So I'm going to just put a little bit of glue. I'm going to use the white lines in the gingham ribbon as kind of a guide. So I'm just going to start and I'm going to put little dabs of glue on every other white line in the center of the ribbon. Okay. And as you can see, this glue comes out super easy. It dries very clear. Just remember to put your cap back on when you're not using your glue. That will help keep the pen tip from drying out. All right, so now I'm going to take my crystal setter tool. Just give your crystals a little shake, and then you want to pick them up at the top side of your crystal. So on the colored side of the crystal. So lift it up, and then we're just going to place it right on our glue dab, like so. I didn't use any kind of pattern. I just kind of used my purple crystals along the purple gingham ribbon. And in both packs of the amethyst ombre and the violet, there's different shades of purple. So there's no rhyme or reason to how I'm putting them on. I'm just kind of using the purple on the purple and the pink on the pink flowers, and then the golden honey on my bunny. Okay, so you can kind of just do the same. So I'm just going to place these crystals down like so. All right. Is everybody caught up to this step, or am I moving too fast for you? All right, so now that I have one of my ribbons done, kind of gonna flip that over. And then I'm going to do this other side of my ribbon. So again, just using that same kind of guidelines, every other white line is what I'm using. And you're just gonna put a little dab of glue on each of those spots. All right. And then you can just kind of place your purple crystals along those lines. So going back to some of the history on the Fabergé egg. So again, they were made for the Romanov family. And what I thought was really cool was that, so Peter Carl Fabergé kind of made the trend of taking everyday objects and turning them into beautiful, you know, creations of jewelry by using embellishing techniques such as stone setting. He used enameling, goldsmithing, and kind of just turn, you know, an everyday object, an egg, into a beautiful work of art.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, no interruption at all.
We have a couple questions.
Please, yes.
One person asked, what is the name of the tool you are using?
So this is a wax tip jewel setter. It comes 3 in a pack. I believe they are $5.99. But all it is, it's just basically a plastic tool here, and then it has a wax tip, and it just makes picking up the crystals so much easier. I would highly, highly recommend getting some type of wax tool pickup. And this is what they sell in store. It's item 224667. Or you can use this here, which comes in the Crystal Radiance set. And this actually comes with 2 wax crayons, which is the same, it's the same purpose. And then it comes with a nice storage case. So this one, I believe, is $7.99. But again, you are getting a great storage case and 2 of these little wax crayon tools to help with your crystal pickup.
I just added the link to the chat too. And then Anton wanted to know if you could please repeat the brand and colors of the crystals.
Absolutely. So these are, here, I'm going to get it really close. So this is the Bead Landing brand, and it's called Crystal Radiance. These are beautiful Austrian crystals. The facets are just gorgeous. They have a lot of fire in them. And then I'm using the Golden Honey, the SS12. I'm using this color mainly on my little bunny body. Then I have the Crystal Radiance Light Rose in an SS10 size. I'm using this color mainly on all of my little pink flowers. And then I have the Crystal Radiance Amethyst Ombre. So this has a few colors of purple in it. I believe there's like tanzanite, amethyst. There's a tanzanite shimmer in here, which is beautiful. It's probably one of my most favorite colors in the Austrian crystal line. And then we have this violet mix, which again, it's different shades of purple. There's not a lot of overlap in each of these mix, which is nice. So there's different shades of purple. And actually these 2 are Hotfix. So you can see the little symbol. So this actually has a special glue on the back that when heated up, it kind of melds into some fabric. So these are actually 4 fabrics, but we're just using them as flatbacks, which they work the same way. I hope that helped. So yeah, I'm just going to continue putting these little crystals on my ribbon. And then I'm going to rotate so I can do this other side here. Again, just going to use my Crystal Radiance glue pen. And I'm going to go every other one. And just start putting my crystals on. Again, there's no particular order of the type of colors I'm doing. I'm just doing my purple on my purple gingham ribbon. So inside these Fabergé eggs was actually filled with a gold yolk, which was why they were, you know, so expensive. And inside the gold yolk was a little tiny golden hen that contained a diamond miniature of the imperial crown, which I thought was really cool. And then it came with a little ruby pendant inside of it. So there were lots of layers to these Fabergé eggs. And something that I thought was really, really cool was that other houses that you may know of now, like Cartier and Tiffany's, actually took note of this, and that's why they started taking these everyday objects and kind of embellishing them because of this Peter Carl Fabergé making these Fabergé style eggs. So that's something that I always thought was really cool. You know, that sometimes you might not even know the nature of. All right, so you're going to do that last row of crystal on your ribbon here, but I'm actually going to just kind of move on because we are running short on time and I want to make sure that we get all of our little bunnies done.
Monica had a question. She wanted to know, she says the amethyst doesn't have any size. They come in different sizes in one pack. Is that right?
That is correct. So the amethyst ombre is actually 3 sizes in one pack. So you're getting an SS12, an SS16, and an SS20 all in kind of one pack. So it's kind of like a mixture of sizes and a mixture of colors in one pack. All right, so now that I'm going to, now that I've got kind of my ribbon done, I'm going to move on and I'm going to do kind of the inside of my bunny. So inside the bunny, I'm going to use my golden honey color. And again, you're just going to put dabs of glue on. There's no pattern. We just kind of want to give him a little bit of sparkle in our bunny. Okay. And I'll do some on his ears here. All right.
I just happened to notice that a lot of the crystals are on sale at Michael's.
Yes, I think they're on sale for what, $4.99?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a great price. Again, Austrian crystals. All right, so now that I have my glue down, I'm just going to take my golden honey crystals and I'm just placing them directly on top of where I have my glue. We got to give this cute little bunny some sparkle.
I love the sparkle.
I never met a sparkle I didn't like.
Felicia says, doing this project, share your craft with us on all social media. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Felicia.
Yeah, please, please, please show us your crafts that you do. Like I said, I just love seeing everybody's stuff that they make. It's always so different and so great. And yeah, please make sure if you post it on social media, use those hashtags so that we can see your beautiful work. All right. So now that I did my little bunny, I'm going to do a little bit of the light rose crystal in the ear here. So I'll just do a few little dabs of glue here. And again, I'm just using my great little tool here to help me pick up my crystals. Sometimes it's all in the tools you use. I know sometimes like new craft hobbies, if you don't have the right tools, you kind of get frustrated at first. And we don't want that. So I would definitely recommend getting yourself one of these little tools here and the glue pen. You will not regret it. I promise you. So now that I have a few crystals in the ear, I'm going to start putting a few crystals on my flowers down here. And I did use a little bit of the purples from my 2 purple mixes and then the pink from the light rose. So you can just put a few dabs of glue. I'm again just kind of using my flowers as my guide to do the glue dots. One over here. Do some of this blue here. There. All right, so then I'm gonna just do some pink on the pink flowers here, or you could do purple too. Has anyone joined us for one of our other classes we've done? I'm just curious if there's any repeat offenders here.
Cameron says me.
Oh, yay. Oh, welcome back, Cameron. Thank you so much for joining us again.
One of the viewers mentioned that they wish the product list had included the wax tip jewel setter.
It did actually include it. It might have been listed under additional tools.
Letty says she also says me too.
Yay, awesome. Welcome back. That's wonderful. Thank you guys so much for attending. All right, I'm just using some of my purple in the purple flowers here. All right. So this side's pretty good. So again, you can do as many or as little as you want. If you want to do more, you could do more. Again, it's just kind of your preference. I kind of used the 4 packs of crystals that I had and just kind of spread them out across the egg. But you could do, I mean, you could do one fully blinged out side if you wanted to. And then left the other sides plain, because again, it is a decor piece. So it's, you know, it's sitting on a shelf or on your mantle. So it's really, it's up to you.
Holly says, what is the link for the paint that was used as the base? I'll provide the link.
Sure. But I will show here again. So it's the Michael's Craft Smart brand, and it's the matte acrylic paint just in a white. I believe they come in a 2 ounce as well. So you could get just the 2 ounce. It's more than enough to do the egg. I grab a 4 ounce just because I do a lot of other types of projects, but yeah, so this is what you want right here. And if you, it doesn't have to be matte. I just chose the matte because again, I like the more antique look. But you don't have to do the matte. You can do the shiny kind of paint as well. All right, so I'm going to go and move on to my next side of the bunny here. And we'll do a little bit on his ears here. Again, I'm going to do my golden honey color. So I believe the last, don't quote me on this, but the last actual Fabergé egg, I believe was purchased in 2007 for like $3.5 million. I mean, like crazy, crazy expensive.
Can you show a close-up once it's completed too?
Sure. Well, if I can get that down. Yep, let me get some crystals on these glue dots and I will gladly show you a close-up. And you can see like I kind of have glue kind of spilling out. Let me get a little bit closer. You can see I kind of have some glue spillage from underneath the crystal, but don't worry about that. Your glue is going to dry clear, so you really won't even notice that at all. So if you do happen to have a little spillage over the sides of the crystal, no worries. Okay. All right. So I'm going to let this dry, and then here I'm going to show you a close-up of the one we kind of had done. Can you see? But these just look so cute, you know, sitting on a shelf or on your mantle. I have these actually on a tiered tray in my kitchen. So it just makes them really cute Easter decor. If you don't want it for Easter, you could do these really for any occasion.
St. Patty's Day.
Yeah, some St. Patty's Day eggs. So see, super easy. Again, a really fun craft to do with kids. I actually had, so it's funny, my son actually wanted to do this egg project. So he actually picked this egg from the store and wanted to make something with it. So that's kind of what we decided on. We decided on doing the little Fabergé egg. And he absolutely loved it. So I want to just again say thank you everybody for joining us. I really, really appreciate it so much. If you have any questions, again, there'll be a video that will be linked, and we will try to answer any of your questions through the YouTube link. And if don't forget, please, 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 if you post your pictures on social media, please use the hashtags. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, I'm so happy that you guys joined us today. And remember, keep calm and sparkle on. Bye.